Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weill. So, why a podcast about death? My daughter Betsy Weill interviews me again. Some have been incredulous, some disgusted. Why would anyone want to listen to, much less create, a podcast about death? In this episode of Unveiling Death, Betsy poses this question. Luckily, like me, she does not find the topic of mortality to be morbid. Chip off the old block. Enjoy our conversation, and please share this and other Unveiling Death episodes with family, friends, enemies, coworkers, anyone. And please follow us.
Hi, Dad.
Hey, Bets.
Okay, so as you've probably already discussed in the intro, this episode is about why you're doing the podcast. So I felt like it would only be fitting for my first question to be, why are you doing the podcast?
Fear. Fear because I used to be, as we've discussed, I think, mortally fearful of death, pun intended. And that's when I was, quite a bit younger, but it lasted for years. Just like sort of stultifying fear I had. And I don't want, number one, I don't want to feel that fear anymore. And I don't, partly because I've been so exposed to death and mourning for so long as a member of, as a clergy person. But I also really don't want other people, including the people I love, to fear death. I fear that fear. So by confronting the inevitability of death, by sort of, according to Seneca, the Roman statesman, philosopher who wrote a lot about facing death, he talked about having contempt for death. Now, I don't believe we should have, I think we should honor death, but I do want to have contempt for the fear of death. I want to sort of snub my nose at that fear that is so common. So that's one reason. The other reason is just like, I do lots of funerals and I'm involved with other people's, helping them through the grieving process. I've grieved myself, and I've just become very accustomed to it, and I am, I would say, fascinated by it, but very comfortable around, death and death issues. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm doing this podcast, Unveiling Death.
Well, I guess I'll say, especially when I was interviewing you about Mikey P, I had some friends reach out to me and say, like, this is so great, but I cannot listen because they're so afraid of death.
Right.
And I'm wondering why you think that is, because I feel like it's something that brings us so much closer to our humanity, which maybe is the problem in the first place. But you'd think that, like, everyone does it. It's like one of the only certain things in life. And yet we're so scared. Personally, as a society, we are always shying away from it. Why?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. A lot of people come up to me and ask me the question that you've asked me. In fact, one reason I wanted to have this conversation was because I get asked this question a lot. And some people are, some people won't listen to it. They tell me they won't listen to it. They just are not interested in this topic. They are, I don't know if they're just indifferent to it, which seems odd, or they're resistant to it. And some think it's obviously morbid. It is about death, after all. So I get this question in a challenging way a lot. Someone recently said, we were talking about taking a vacation and relaxing a little bit. He said, "Don't do your podcast because you'll just feel sad or depressed from the podcast." And I said, that's not my experience with this podcast or my experience with talking to people about death. I do think that people would be better served, in their own lives in accepting, if they were to accept death. There are people in their, advanced ages just really resistant to it. And, in terms of like the individuals themselves, those who are very old, like that's also sad to have lived, deep into senescence, old age, and to still have this paralyzing fear. Maybe that's overstating it somewhat. I'd say it's not a lot of people, but some people, but still have this great fear of death, I can't blame them. I validate the feelings, but I want others not to feel that way. I want them not to feel that way. Um, and I've had some situations, where people just do not want to make decisions that would, again, allow the natural course of things to happen and for their old and sick parents to die. And that seems, again, to be putting everyone in a more stressful
It's a disservice
disservice. Yeah, to whom do you mean?
to the person who's dying to not sanctify it or like die with intention also, and to be like fighting it
Right.
when it's not even their fight really if they're not the one dying.
Right.
Maybe because we haven't really dealt with it so much like on a societal level, or we really like repress it on a societal level, at least from my perspective. Maybe that's why it's so hard to confront death, because the only time that you actually confront death is when you're grieving or when you're dying, which is not how it should be, in my opinion. But you have confronted death, I mean, both in your fear from when you were younger, but also on a professional level. You've been doing funerals for years and often. And I'm wondering about the relationship between the two.
Right. Well, yeah, I think the professional dealing in death has really helped to alleviate that fear. It's just, so common for me. And I'm not unemotional when I'm dealing with a death professionally. When I'm sitting with a grieving family, or I'm officiating a funeral, or I'm, with the family after someone has died, or whatever it is. I feel like I'm present, but there's also a little bit of sort of more of a cognitive thing going on in my, with my brain, that I'm feeling like, okay, this is what I've got to do. I am present for them. I'm helping them. I'm guiding them. I hope, in my best moments. Sometimes I'm sure I'm not as successful as others, but I also understand, like, and then we move on, and there are other things that I need to do, and that's actually, in a sense, happened also in, personal losses. People close to me who have died, and I've learned that you deal with the grief, and I have had some, really sad losses. My father, my dear friend Mike, and other people. But you deal with the grief, but you also, allow yourself step by step, sort of steadily, to move on with the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You must.
Yeah.
And I don't want sort of a overwhelming grief to really overwhelm everything else. But then again, you can't control your emotions in these times of tremendous sadness and stress.
Yeah. Do you feel like you stop grieving ever?
Well, we talked about this when you interviewed me about Mikey P, Michael Petriano, that I did not know how that grief would end. But yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, like the mourning does, yes, the mourning does end.
Yeah.
It's like, the dear friend is not forgotten, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's still grief. I would say even remembering a lot, and missing even, is, for me at least, not necessarily grief.
Yeah.
It's something else. But again, I don't want to in any way invalidate or second guess or challenge anyone else's experience of grief. But I will say that Poppy, my father, was a very forward-looking person. And so, because he was so forward-looking, and both of his parents died, pretty young. I mean, his father at, I think, 50, I think that's right, and his mother at 62 or 63, something like that. So, he had loss, and but he was really a forward-looking person, and did not talk about his sadnesses very much. And I think that that's also in the mix for me about my feelings about death, and and maybe that allows me to do this podcast too.
Yeah.
Like I don't have a breezy feeling about death. I
Yeah.
don't. But I think that his ability or desire to look ahead, kind of optimistically to the future,
Hmm.
probably helps me too.
So, why do you care on a personal level about changing the conversation for everybody?
About death?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that question.
Mm.
Like, why don't I just care about like how I feel about death, or how I
Right.
and my dear ones, like our family feels about death? Why do I care about others? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there is in the podcast. I hope there is some teaching involved. I mean, and I think there's stuff to learn from these conversations that I'm having with people, and so as a rabbi, I'm a teacher, and so I do hope that this. It's really part of the intention too, that this podcast is a teaching tool for people, and so it's probably partly that, just my impulse, and the sense of obligation to teach.
Yeah. And
Uh,
also, you found something that you care about, and
yeah,
so why not spread the good word?
exactly. The good word about death.
Yeah, the good word about death. Well, that's true.
Yeah,
The good word about death doesn't have to be bad words about death.
correct. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to make sure that I want to amend something that, or emend something. I want to mend something that I said before. So, I would say most people, most older people, and I have a congregation of a lot of folks who are older. Most of them really are making their peace with
Hmm.
their mortality.
Yeah.
I really think that's true. So there are the exceptions for sure, absolutely, and but most folks have that, that well of wisdom, because
Yeah.
they're, most human beings are thoughtful and reflective people. I actually believe that that's true. So, but there are I would say a minority, not a completely insignificant minority, but a minority of people who really have not.
Hmm.
And for some reason, I feel compelled to try to get them to feel otherwise.
Well, because you're not just a teacher, but you're also like a therapist.
Right. I mean, I have
So,
a pastoral relationship with them, and a
yeah.
friendly relationship with them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess when you keep on living, you just gain um like perspective.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you can't really reach the age of death, at least not comfortably, without being like, okay, I guess this is kind of the next step for me.
Right.
At a certain point, it is the next step.
And people do realize that.
Yeah, right. And that at 23, I can't understand, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
Right.
Like, it would be unnatural for me to be like, oh, that's next.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or
Right.
I'd be considered sick if I thought that it was.
Right. It would not be healthy.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one other aspect of why I want to do this podcast, I just want to mention.
Mm.
Like I like talking to people. I like kind of helping to reveal or bring out people's personalities and interests and deep feelings. And so talking to folks about death is a great way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's one author of a book related to death that I wanted to have on the podcast, and he and I had a preliminary conversation. And I asked him if he would be willing to answer my personal questions, like how has your research about death affected you? He said, I don't want to talk about that. Like, he's just not interested in that. And so I we both agreed that this is not the right podcast for him to be on as a guest, because I want to bring up the personal,
Mm-hmm.
and to, sort of like asking someone, how they feel about love and relationships, or how they feel about like their hobbies, or talk about your childhood. I mean, it reveals a lot.
Yeah.
I like creating pictures of people's actual lives.
Yeah.
So death is one way to do that.
Yeah. And I guess this is a good, just next question. It's very practical, but like, what do you want when someone finishes an episode of
Mhm.
Unveiling Death?
Mm-hmm.
What do you want them to like be like, oh, this was the point?
Right. Well, first I want them to share it with all their friends.
Right. Of course.
So for those of you who are still listening, please share this with all your friends and your enemies. That's okay too.
They
but
die too.
everyone does. It's the crazy thing about death. So what you're asking? What I want them to have learned?
Yeah, like if you want them to know about their personal lives, about how their work impacts them, about whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. A good question, and people have asked. You've asked me this question. Like, what's the point of this? And I have to confess, I don't know. I just want to have the conversations about lots of things related to death. For those who have listened, I've spoken to an astronomer about the universe and death, and I've spoken to a palliative care doctor and a hospice social worker and an obituary writer, and lots more. A death cafe facilitator, and a lot of great conversations. I just like the conversations, and the only thing that they have in common is death.
Oh, okay.
Right, that they relate to death in some significant way.
Yeah.
Very often personal. Talk to a funeral director.
And they're comfortable with it.
And they're very comfortable with it. I mean, really, everyone has been comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Almost. But everyone's at least comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
So what I want the listener to come away with, there's no one thing. I want them to just think.
Yeah.
Feel and think.
Yeah. Well, there's one more commonality between everybody who's been interviewed, and you're no exception. Here's the last question.
Okey-dokey.
What song do you want to listen to as you lay dying?
Everybody was kung fu fighting. Ha!
See, like, you're so old that's I don't even understand that that's a joke. Like, it's just like not in my.
Those cats were fast as lightning. Yeah.
Like, I think you're joking.
Even though it was a little bit frightening. Yeah. What? There's a Kung Fu Panda. It's in Kung Fu Panda too, but it's an older song. So what song? Well, that's a good question, because I have asked this question in almost all the podcasts at the conclusion, but now I'm being asked, and I honestly. There's a song called Bird's Song, B-I-R-D, Bird's Song by the Grateful Dead, which is really sublime and beautiful. It's got a gorgeous little guitar kind of melody to it. So that would be really, really nice. But honestly, the music that is most satisfying and fulfilling to me is the music of nature. So if it could be possible for me to be tied to a large log next to a river with bird songs, actual bird songs, and not like a Spotify's, so they have these nature Spotify songs about
to help you go to sleep,
right, which I use those too. But if I can honestly be out in nature, hearing, the wind in the leaves and a river, or birds, that's the song that I want to hear as I lay dying.
I'll make a note of it.
Please do. Thanks to Betsy Weill for interviewing me again. Thank you, creative director, editor, and son Sammy Weill. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you're listening to right now. Contact me at rabbiw14@gmail.com. And thank you so much for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes every other Monday.